Are we supposed to have visitors today?
Negative, sir.
Welcome back to my channel, everyone, and welcome to my channel if this is your first time. This is a combination video, so this is two things at once, which I'll explain in a second. But basically, I'm going to be looking at a particular book that has a history of being banned or challenged, but also is something that in an ongoing project I'm doing anyway. So, I'm looking at this book, Ray Bradbury, The Martian Chronicles. So this is a book that has been challenged or banned, and it's part of a project called 24 for 24, which is a project that's been initiated by MJ from Reading This Life, and she thought it'd be a really cool idea to celebrate books that have been banned, because so often they're for spurious reasons that should not be reasons to censor or ban a book. So she did a really impassioned video in December to try and encourage us to read banned books, which some of us are doing. So we're reading 24 banned books in 2024, and this is the fourth book, I think, in that series of books I've been reading, and is actually the fourth book in my Ray Bradbury deep dive as well. So it just coincides. Just happened to have been banned as well. So it was kind of like it covers both things. But I was going to reread this anyway. I've read this years ago, but I was going to reread this as part of this Ray Bradbury deep dive, which it's been interesting reading it, knowing that it's also been challenged as well. But I'll tell you a little bit about his publication history. So Ray Bradbury was a huge fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs, who famously wrote lots of books set on Mars with John Carter, the Martian Chronicles, and those books have been hugely influential on Star Wars and Flash Gordon and all sorts of things, but on Ray Bradbury as well. And Ray Bradbury was one of many people that were excited by the idea of Mars. It's obviously a planet that's very close to us, and knowledge of what Mars was quite vague at the time, but they knew enough to be excited about it. And Edgar Rice Burroughs had written the Mars books like Princess of Mars, God of Mars, Warrior of Mars, all those things. And Ray Bradbury loved those, and he wanted to write a book about Mars. And the Martians in this book are basically allegorical. Sorry, I was a bit distracted. Allegorical characters, and the setting is like an allegorical thing about Earth and humans, really. But anyway, Ray Bradbury wrote this in 1950. Or at least he published this in 1950. But this is a fix-up novel, so it's a collection of short stories that had already been published separately in magazines, pulp magazines, through the 40s. So he put them all together in this collection, and that happened quite a lot. So there's another famous version of a fix-up novel, which is Clifford Simak's City. That's another novel that was originally lots of separate stories. And what usually happens is a writer might sort of write little linking bits, or they might rewrite little parts of it so that it follows a narrative better, which he did do. But I would say that the narrative is quite loose, and they're not that tied together. But they're tied together enough for this to be consistent enough. But you can tell it's a fix-up novel when you read it. So he published these stories together as the Martian Chronicles in 1950. And in 1951, it came out in Britain as The Silver Locusts. So they were actually different books. So there was there was a story that was in The Silver Locusts that wasn't in this. And similarly, there was a book that wasn't in this, that was in this, that wasn't in The Silver Locusts. So in The Silver Locusts, there was a story called The Fire Balloons, which is a really good story, that wasn't in the original version of the Martian Chronicles. And then in the original version of the Martian Chronicles, but not in the Silver Locusts, was a story called Usher 2. And Usher 2 is really interesting because that story is all about book banning. And it clearly, Ray Bradbury was thinking about these things quite intensely, because the next book he wrote after this was Fahrenheit 451, which is the mega famous book about book burning and censorship. So the fact that Usher 2 wasn't in The Silver Locust is interesting, because it's such an important story. So 1950, this came out. 1951, The Silver Locust came out. And another thing that's interesting about the way it's been published is when it originally came out, it was set in 2002. And then when they brought out a 1997 version, they changed the setting so that it was then set in 2033. So clearly, by this point in 1997, they thought it was too close to 2002 for it to be realistic. So they moved the date. And ironically, now we're in 2024. We clearly are not going to colonize Mars in 2033. But that's what they decided to do in 1997. So there has been some changes made to the book. And this is an edition from 2008. And this has all of the stories in it. So I do have copies of The Silver Locust as well, but this is a copy with all of it, with all of the stories in it. So it's a really interesting collection of stories and an interesting book, because it does have Ray Bradbury tackling really big themes like race and gender, colonialism, imperialism, racism, human nature in the way that we behave with others, Orientalism, the Cold War, the fear of nuclear war, environmentalism, all sorts of things are covered in this book. So it's a very multifaceted, layered book. So that alone makes it quite an interesting book, I think, to read. So why was it banned? There were 3 reasons why it was banned. It was banned for profanity, so curse words are in here. So that was one of the reasons. It was also banned because it was accused of using the Lord's name in vain. So that's another one, clearly religious reasons. And the third reason is a bit more interesting, because I think it's probably still relevant now, which is the use of the N-word. So it was banned for offensive racial language. And that's in a story called Way Up in the Middle of the Air, where there's a racist character in the story. So he's exploring all these different things in this book, and those are the reasons why it's banned. And I think this shouldn't be banned. It's a really interesting book that explores themes really well in a science fiction setting, with really poetic, beautiful prose that you're used to seeing with Ray Bradbury. So it's written really nicely, and it's a great piece of literature. So even though these are separate stories, there is a kind of a narrative thread, a loose thread, where you've got the early part of the book kind of sets this idyllic Martian scene with these Martians and this sort of family situation, and there's this sort of peaceful setting to Mars, and then there's this sort of these bad dreams about Earth visitors. They say, oh, this place called Earth, I don't know what it is. And anyway, through the process of these stories, it becomes about humans colonizing Mars, or attempting to colonize Mars, and visiting, and basically the effect on Mars and Martians. And I think there's several reasons why that's really interesting, because in this story called And the Moon Be Still as Bright, there's an astronaut called Cherokee, who's a Native American astronaut, and that's not a coincidence, because the reason why I think Ray Bradbury made that astronaut Native American is because he's making a really clear allegorical reference to the fact that these astronauts visit Mars, and they have this devastating effect on the Martians because they all get decimated by chicken pox. And if you know your American history, the Native Americans were hugely, horrifically affected by smallpox in the 1600s. So he's making a reference to something that actually happened, and talking about how settlers will carelessly affect an indigenous population without care or consideration, and I think that's really interesting. So the effect of colonizing Mars is a big part of that, and also within that you've got that idea of Orientalism, because you've got this other that's explored in it as well. So that's true. And also the threat of nuclear war was hanging over the time as well, because this is 1950, and it wasn't that long after Nagasaki and Hiroshima had happened, and the Cold War had started, and there was this sort of fear of nuclear weapons. And in the story called There Will Come Soft Rains, a bomb is dropped on a city in California and completely desolates it, just completely flattens it. And that kind of precipitates humans going to Mars to try and settle. And some of them do manage to stay there, and there is some sort of equilibrium established. But there is a general point in the book about the way that humans will force their own culture on another culture, and there's this sort of will to do that. And it does celebrate exploration, but it says and the book says it needs to be done in a particular way, and you shouldn't be affecting indigenous populations like has done in history. And there's a sort of message about how we impose ourselves on other cultures. So I think that's a really interesting thing that's in this book, very clear point that's been made in the book. And there's also explorations of gender. There's a story where the relationship with women is being explored a little bit more, and some people find that a bit dated. But again, I think it's part. One of the fascinating things in this book is there's so much to kind of pick apart, so much to think about from what he's put in this book. So that's what a lot of those stories are doing. There's another separate one that's not really necessarily looking at political themes, but it's kind of an interesting addition to the book, which is a book called Night Meeting, which is a time travel story. So I love the fact there's a time travel story in the book as well. So there's so many different elements to the book. And you could argue that the reason why it's so varied and there's so many different styles of writing in there, or different narratives, is because there's a selection of short stories. But they have got this sort of narrative thread that does successfully have some kind of consistency, even though it's not really tight, but it's definitely that consistency. So yeah, the Night Meetings story is really, really good, and it's got a really nice ending as well. So I would say this is a really good book with a good story, but lots of stories. But it's a really good book. It's one of his best. Some people think it's their favourite. It's not my favourite, but it's definitely one of my favourites. It definitely shouldn't be banned. It's a really interesting insight into a man's fears about the Cold War, about nuclear weapons, and about and a man making comments about how we impose ourselves on other people. A really important and still relevant comment about the way we treat Native Americans and that whole idea of race relations. And yeah, it's just a brilliant book. So definitely recommend it. So check it out. Ray Bradbury, Martian Chronicles, or The Silver Locust. Thanks a lot for watching. Stay curious, guys. Bye. Picture of what it's like to be